And I've had conversations with some of my colleagues or nursing staff who say, I'm dead inside. And they don't say that with emergency medicine sort of black humor, but with like real tragic, sober honesty that the horrible, evil suffering that we see has produced this deadening in them that makes them unable to enjoy the beauty of the world.
Love God, love people, love people, love people. It's the AC podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Hi, and welcome to the AC podcast. This is Andy Steiger, and I am joined today with special guest Quentin Genuis. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to be with you. We are in downtown Vancouver, or Vancouver, downtownish.
Close to that.
We're at a lovely church that has allowed us to film here today. As we're talking with Quentin about his faith journey and also what it looks like to be a Christian as you work through tragedy, which you do on a regular basis. You are an ER doctor.
Yeah, so I can tell you a little bit about myself off the top. So
Yeah.
I'm married. I have 4 kids. We just had our 4th child a couple of weeks ago. So it's a big summer for me.
And one of the questions I asked you is whether or not you delivered your children, but you said, no, I just wanted to be
Yeah, I actually,
on the sidelines.
yeah, with my first child, my older daughter, we had a midwife in Edmonton, which is where we lived then, and she was great. And I think she thought that she and I had this sort of unspoken agreement that I was going to deliver the baby at the end. And so I will always remember my wife, Keelan, was sort of about to deliver our daughter, and the midwife looked at me across the bed and said, "So are you going to deliver the baby?" And I said, "Oh no." So I felt like my role in that space is to be there with Kaylin and to support and love her as I can in that moment, and then we can celebrate meeting our child together. So I have delivered babies before. I've delivered a few babies in the emergency department, which is always wild. But none of my own children. So
Okay. And so you have a newborn.
Yeah.
5 weeks old.
5 weeks old. Yeah, her name's Junia Karis. Yeah, and what I do when I'm not hanging out with my kids, my main job is that I'm an emergency doctor. It's something I'm very grateful to do. I love it a lot. I work mostly at St. Paul's, which is the big tertiary hospital in downtown Vancouver. And so my practice has a lot of addictions work and with the downtown east side population that I'm really passionate about. I have a few other jobs on the side too, but
Let's talk about that though, because one of them is with regards to ethics, which is I think really interesting because when you and I first met, I actually found out that not only were you a doctor, but you had done a master's degree at St. Andrews in Scotland in the area of theology. And so, tell me about that. So how did the ethicist part of your work come in, and what role do you play in ethics here in Vancouver?
Yeah, this is I so often reflect on how kind the Lord has been to me in my life, and how in retrospect things seem so linear and clear to tell a certain story of my life, the story of becoming friends with God and trying to love my neighbor. But in the moment, looking prospectively, sometimes it all feels so muddled and unclear, and you're just reacting to things. So I did my undergrad at King's University, which is a Christian university in Edmonton. And I entered my undergrad intending to go to med school, just thinking I was sort of a sciencey guy, only going to do chemistry and physics and those kinds of things to get into med school. But I had to take these mandatory theology and philosophy classes that at that time I saw as annoying and just distracting from my goal-oriented med school journey. But something happened to me there when I was taking those classes, and I had some excellent professors. Doug Herink is one name of a theologian who studied there who had a huge impact on my life. People who loved God with their mind, and that expressed itself as being professors and teaching theology and philosophy. And so I went through my journey and eventually got into med school. And I found in my first couple of years of med school that I so deeply missed those theology and philosophy classes that I had probably complained about so much. And one day I used to work at a farmer's market in Edmonton, and I ran into Doug Herink, this theology professor I had. I was telling him that I was feeling restless. I liked medicine. I liked physiology. I loved the idea of caring for people, but I felt like I was missing something. And he said, you should just go do a master's degree. And there's these great universities in Scotland, and I have some connections there. You should try to see if you can fit it in. So I went to well, first of all, I applied without telling them, without telling U of A. So I applied and got accepted to this master's degree in theology with some focus on medical ethics. And then I went to the dean of the med school, or one of the assistant deans at U of A, and I pitched him this idea that they give me an academic leave of absence to take a year to study theology in Scotland. And they very fortunately were really supportive of me doing that. So I took a year off of med school in between my second and third years, moved to Scotland, and studied theology again with specific focus on the relationship of theological ethics to medical ethics.
Which, by the way, what a great place to do it, because St. Andrews has got to be one of the most beautiful campuses I've ever been to. It's right on the ocean. It's got this beautiful, like, not only geographically beautiful setting, but also just historically rich, buildings and heritage. So that must have been a cool place to live and study.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was such a gift to my life to live in St. Andrews. I didn't drive or step into a car for months. I just had a bike. It's a tiny little town, and I just studied and read and argued about theology with all these other students there. And I again there encountered teachers of theology who were people who deeply loved God with their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and who practiced theology as part of a integrated Christian life.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes in my younger life, I encountered certain kinds of anti-intellectualism in some Christian settings, and people who were maybe suspicious of, philosophy or academic study because they saw it as potentially degrading or erosive to faith. And at St. Andrews, I just encountered people who are the smartest people I've ever met, who are so well read and versed in history. But all of that was a way of loving God. And so they integrated the practice and life of faith with rich, vigorous intellectual work so well. And that was really formative for me. One story I love to tell about that is that the Baptist church I went to there had a number of professors from the university who were, or TA and lecturers at the university who attended that church. And one of the gentlemen who, during the week, we would go to St. Mary's, which is the divinity school, and, he would be there lecturing, and all the students would say, think of him as so eminent because he was so brilliant. But on Sunday mornings, he was the first person there setting up the chairs for the church, and they filled up their communion cups manually. So he would stand there and just like pour grape juice into the tiny little cups. And he just was serving the church with such joy.
Mm,
And that for him fit very naturally. He didn't see himself as above that in any way because he was a professional theologian. So I love St. Andrews.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's what it really looks like, though, doesn't it? Like when you love God and you love people and you're living out your faith, it looks like serving, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about what books have you read, but how do you live that out day to day? And now you're doing that in a unique way in that I think it's interesting that you took this break in medical school to get this training that would actually play such a pivotal role in the work that you do as a doctor. Because there's two things I really want to talk about today, as we go into your story. And one is, how do you live as a Christian in the midst of the chaos of the ER room, right? And you're with people at their darkest moment in these incredible crises and challenges. And then as well, the ethics that play into the work that you do, because you also wear an ethics hat in the city. So what's the role that you have there?
Yeah. And I think my master's degree prepared me for what I'm doing now in a way that I could have never anticipated. I think if you would have asked me what I was doing when I was at St. Andrews, I would have said, I don't really know. I don't know how to integrate that. I want to be a physician together with studying Athanasius and Bonhoeffer or whatever. But now, so I have this role with Providence Health where I'm a physician ethicist. And so it's, like I said, it's not most of my time. Most of my time is clinically working.
Yeah.
But my job as a physician ethicist is to try to help our organization understand how to pursue the good. And so a lot of that is through teaching other physicians, but also teaching other staff who work in our hospitals and other facilities. And ethics, as you well know, is basically about pursuing the good and developing and stewarding precise, rich language to describe the good, but then applying that in very difficult, complex, and sometimes ambiguous situations. And so,
On that note, I think this is an important point to highlight, especially that I've seen in my own research, that people need to appreciate that often in a society, the ethical challenges that we're working through at any given moment within a culture, the front lines of that tend to be in medicine. They tend to be our doctors. And pursuing the good is such an important question that a doctor needs to be thinking about, and that our hospitals need to be working through, because that's the front lines. But there's kind of two components to that as I see it. One is you have the societal level, but then you also have the personal level that you've got to walk through, those ethical dilemmas that you're encountering on a daily basis.
yeah, totally. And I agree. One thing I really like about having a background in theology and philosophy and studying medical ethics is that everybody agrees that it's relevant. Most people I know who are philosophers, if they try to give an elevator pitch to someone why their degree matters, people don't agree. They're really into Kant or Nietzsche or Aristotle. Most people aren't that engaged with those thinkers in our time. But someone said to me once that medical ethics saved philosophy from obscurity. And I think that with respect to much of the popular conversation, that's true, that medical ethical questions touch on deep human questions. What is human life? What defines a human being and a human person? What is death? What defines good dying? How do we live well and try to find joy in the midst of a world where there is a horrible suffering? Those are obviously not narrow medical questions, but oftentimes most people engage them, as you say, in medical contexts, because people often don't think about them until they're forced to, because the frailty of our bodies leads us to engage those questions in the context of sickness.
So let's jump into that, because this is an important topic of how do you walk through the frailty and the challenges of life. Now, I pastored for 20 years. Yeah, I encountered quite a bit, but mine was spread out over a long period of time. Whereas yours, I mean, you're dealing with this day in, day out on a regular basis of these incredible, tragic moments. And a question that I get asked quite a bit by people is, how do you walk through that tragedy and not lose yourself and not lose your faith in the midst of it? And so I've got my own response to that, but I'm very curious to hear what yours is. So when you're dealing with those just tragic moments and you're seeing the frailty of life over and over again, like, how do you walk that as a Christian?
Thank you for that question. It's obviously something that's very deeply personal to me. I think the first thing that I want to say is that medicine is a vocation that involves placing yourself proximate to the suffering of other people continually. And that shares in common that feature with many other vocations, including being a pastor in slightly different ways. But the core commitment of a physician is the commitment to be present to someone who is in pain. I cannot cure everyone. I cannot even improve everyone's outcomes. But my core commitment is to be present to that person in that moment with a certain kind of a stance. I think some immature approaches to medicine in our day and age suggest that you can do that without suffering. And they say you can be proximate to the suffering of others. And if you have a certain kind of professional distance or a certain kind of attitude, you can do that without it affecting yourself. I take that premise as false. And I think when I teach medical students and even other physicians and colleagues about this issue, I take it as a premise that being proximate to the suffering of other people invites suffering into your life. And there's no sense trying to avoid that. The best thing is to soberly acknowledge that and to actually speak of that using the Christian language of compassion, which literally means co-suffering. And to first and foremost try to develop the ability to be present to a suffering person without shrinking from them. And this often makes me think of the book of Job, actually, where, Job's friends get so much bad rap in our time, and they deserve some of it. But actually, when Job was suffering in a way that was completely inexplicable to them, the first thing they did is they went and they sat on the ground with him quietly for 7 days. And we have a lot to learn from that. And I don't know that many of us would be able to do that without opening our big mouths and trying to pontificate about this or that. So, as a basic premise, I would say, as a physician, my responsibility is to be present to the suffering of other people, and that invites suffering into my life. And
And I think that's such an important point just to highlight is that proximity aspect of it, because this is something you see in counseling, 101 is what do people need at the end of the day when they're going through brokenness? They just need community. They need the relationship. They need you to be in proximity to them. They don't need some great, wisdom, or pontificating or whatever it is. They need you.
totally.
They need you. But that means that you now have to be in that uncomfortable position of being with them as they suffer.
Yeah. So I have two broad thoughts about how I encounter this. My first and probably most basic thought comes from a bit of the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. And in the Four Quartets, he says, "We only live, only suspire, consumed by either fire or fire." And he means it means something slightly different than what I'm using it for, but I still think it applies broadly. And he describes this human condition where we only live by being consumed by a fire or a different fire. And so for me, when I think about what I do, I take as a premise that I will invite suffering and difficulty into my life by being proximate to those who suffer. And that's worthwhile because God loves those people so deeply, and God is attentive to them, and God cares for the sparrows and the lilies, and how much more does God care for every last person. And so it is an honor for me to be proximate to their suffering, but that invites suffering into my life. And the key question for me is, which fire will I be consumed by? And how will I suffer for love? And I think that many people in our time prefer to try a stoic answer. They say, grit your teeth, do not feel, repress, and
Numb yourself.
numb yourself as a way of coping. And many people are taught that that is a way of avoiding suffering. But that, in my mind, leads to this condition that people in medicine commonly talk about using the language of burnout or compassion fatigue or even moral distress, where people they genuinely stop themselves from feeling the bad things, but they then feel unable to feel the good things. They feel profoundly depersonalized and nihilistic. And cynical and sad. And
You think that's where alcohol and drug addiction can come in for different people, where they're trying to, or different escapes where they're trying to not feel numb?
yeah, I think certainly like substances are a way when people feel like they can't feel anything, using substances can be one way of trying to help themselves feel something again. And I've had conversations with some of my colleagues or nursing staff who say, I'm dead inside. And they don't say that with emergency medicine sort of black humor, but with like real tragic, sober honesty that the horrible, evil suffering that we see has produced this deadening in them that makes them unable to enjoy the beauty of the world and the beauty of our patients, which I think is a critical piece here. So that's one fire. But there's another fire, and that fire is the fire of compassion. And medicine and encountering the suffering of other people can prompt you to this space that's deadening, that is a horrible kind of suffering, or it can make you softer.
Yeah.
And that's a much more vulnerable place, I think. But allowing yourself to suffer with those who suffer, to weep with those who weep, to grieve with those who grieve. And to do that requires disciplines in your life. And for me, those are disciplines of quiet, disciplines of a prayer. I drive through the downtown east side every day on my way to work. And it's a little bit out of my way, but that's one of those disciplines of my life on the way to work, to drive down Hastings and to remember the suffering there, but also the beauty there, how much God loves each of those persons and how much I owe to them.
If anybody's unfamiliar with Vancouver, we have a street called Hastings, which is a couple blocks that is probably some of the worst homelessness that I've ever seen. And I'm from Portland, Oregon. So, we'll often point our fingers at homelessness elsewhere, but Vancouver, man, they got this one street that is just really, really bad. And that's interesting. Just drive, because there is that temptation to just avoid it, right? Like I just don't want to see it. But when you do see it and you're making yourself see it, you have to wrestle with it. And it's interesting you say that, Quentin, because for me, my answer is very similar to yours actually, because people ask, "Oh, how do you walk, through tragedy with people?" And what I have come to see is the necessity to see the evil.
Right.
That part of the not taking the numbing route is to say that evil is real, that evil is terrible, and that the world ought not be that way. And that makes you want to pursue the good. Right. And that, because where I see people lose themselves is when they start to question whether or not there is good and evil. Right. And they'll give up on God because the world's so broken. And I really think that C.S. Lewis was right when he says, well, if you're calling it a crooked line, you must have some idea of a straight line, but where you can see people go, oh, I'm just going to get rid of the crooked line, the straight line. And it's just this very nihilistic view of life. And man, it just becomes a dark, vacuumous hole that you get sucked into, and you would feel dead inside.
Totally. And I feel like I don't feel that encountering suffering tempts me to lose my faith. Like, if anything, it makes me long for the peace and justice of God.
That's what it does to me as well.
And even I think about this with our patients from the downtown east side, who are truly wonderful, beautiful people from whom we have so much to learn. And I feel in our society, nobody pays attention to the good and wonderful and beautiful things about them. And that makes me long for the day of Christ, for the God who is the one who sees them and knows them and loves them, and the beautiful gifts of their life, which are so often not recognized in our time. There will be a day when those things are recognized, when those seeds come to flower. And so in that sense, suffering and tragedy make me deeply sad. And I feel, like I said, that the fire of compassion has made me softer. Like, I wouldn't have done this when I started, but now I cry with patients. I sit and put my arm around them, and sometimes I have to stop for a few minutes to, just to recalibrate a bit, to be able to do the job that I do. But that doesn't challenge my belief in the truth of God's goodness. If anything, it makes me cry out like the psalmist, sometimes longing for God's peace and justice.
Let me ask you, Quentin, if we could just back up on your story a little bit.
Yeah.
No, that's good. That's good. But I want to just back up a little bit and ask, how did you become a Christian?
So
And why?
Yeah. So I'm really grateful in that my faith is something that I received. And so my parents are wonderful examples of the faith to me, who instilled in me from a very young age that I was a part of the family of God. And my faith is something I received from them. I received from my grandparents, from my older siblings, and from many people, teachers, and people in my church throughout my sort of young age. And I was listening to another podcast actually recently that had Stanley Hauerwas on. And Stanley Hauerwas, for anyone who doesn't know, is a theologian from the United States. I'm a big fan of him. He's an older gentleman. I think he's in his 80s now. But someone asked him why he was a Christian, and he said, I'm kind of surprised to find myself as a Christian, as someone who's later on in life. And he said, because I know how sinful I am, but looking back, I've seen that God has made me his friend, almost despite myself. And I resonated with that very deeply, that I know how sinful I am. I know that evil exists. I don't have to look at more, out at anyone else. I only have to look in.
Yeah.
To know that there is such a thing as evil. But I am, not as old as Stan Hauerwas, but starting to realize that by God's grace and not by my doing primarily, God has made me his friend. I think that as someone who received the faith, there's always a journey, in young adult time of,
Did you have moments of doubt?
for sure. And I think that anybody who says that they don't haven't had moments of doubt is probably lying. I don't want to accuse anyone of lying, but I think everyone has moments of doubt, and
I actually think doubt's normal. It's
yeah,
actually healthy.
exactly. And I actually think that part of the credibility of someone's faith is their ability to soberly look their doubts eye to eye
Yeah.
and be gentle with themselves in their doubts. One of my favorite poems is by a Scottish poet named Robert Crawford. That's called Thread, and the poem is very short, so I'll just say it to you.
Yeah.
He says, "My faith hangs by a thread. It always has. No sense spending long going over it, wondering, will it snap? Will it go? Is it the wrong kind of faith? Better just to take it and sow." And I really like that image that my faith isn't a strong, invincible thing. My faith is a small thing that's subject to emotions and fatigue and doubt and all of those human factors. But God knows that about me, and God loves me very deeply. And my weak faith in the strong, immovable reality of Christ is a thread that can sew beautiful things. And so I think, especially in my years as an undergraduate studying theology and philosophy, reading Nietzsche, reading the Grand Inquisitor, there were some texts that really challenged my faith and caused me to question whether or not, you know, the evil and suffering that I see in the world is compatible with a God who is light, in whom there's no darkness at all. And yeah, and I wrestled and still wrestle with those questions. And yesterday I was driving down Hastings and I was listening to a worship song that says, if he blesses the lilies with beauty and splendor, how much more will he clothe you? How much more does he love you? And I looked out my window and I saw a bunch of human beings who were not dressed and who were suffering profoundly. And there's real angst there and wrestling still. But I truly believe, both intellectually and emotionally, that Christianity presents real, rigorous answers to those questions and doubts. And most deeply, those answers are a certain kind of presence, which is the revealed presence of God in the person of Jesus.
Speaking of Jesus, have you ever thought, like, what would it be like if Jesus was heading to work with me, sort of idea? Because I've often thought, okay, if I'm driving down Hastings, I can't help but feel like if Jesus was in the car, I would feel very uncomfortable
Yeah.
with him, because I'd be like, he's probably going to do something that's going to make me feel uncomfortable. He's probably going to want to be like, hey, Andy, why don't you stop the car? We got some ministry to do here. I'm like, yeah, like, are you sure? Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't think that Jesus makes us feel as uncomfortable as he probably should.
Yeah. Yeah. I had an encounter with a patient a few weeks ago. There's a gentleman who was an interpreter for Canada and Afghanistan. And when the situation changed in Afghanistan a year or two ago, whenever that was, he escaped and has been traveling, trying to get to Canada, where he has some family. And he arrived one evening, I don't know all the backstory, but he arrived in the Vancouver International Airport and sort of said that he was arriving as a refugee. And they were sort of teeing him up for some stuff, but all that was given to him initially was a bus ticket and an address of a shelter in the downtown east side. So this gentleman, who was, an engineer from back home, who was, coming from a very different culture, arrived at this shelter in the downtown east side and was quite shocked by, some of the things that he saw and the drug use and those kinds of things. And so he came to St. Paul's and said, I don't feel comfortable staying there, and I need another option. And so we were working with our social workers to try to find him something and see if we could find something that worked for him overnight until he had some further support from the refugee services the next day. But I felt in my conscience this small voice saying, like, why why shouldn't you take him home and let him sleep in your guest bedroom? Um, but I didn't, because I felt like, well, that's not my job, and But I realized, like, that's what God has done for me, like, adopted me, and I was not just a stranger to God; I was an enemy of God. This man was a stranger to me, but God has done all of that and so much more for me. And and in that sense, and in similar stories, I feel like I commit sins of omission every day, in not doing enough for my patients, and not offering them gift, and not offering them the radical love that God loves them with. And yeah, and that's a really hard balance with trying to do my job as an emergency doctor, and like, we have a full waiting room and I have to see patients,
And being a father and a
yeah.
husband and everything else. No, I get it. It's challenging, and that's part of I think that's part of this, the struggle of living in a broken world.
Mhm.
Let me ask you a question as we come in for a landing
Yeah.
here. Man, because there's just so many different things that we could talk
Yeah.
about, and I know we're going to have you back on the podcast because I told you already before we started this. Okay, we're going to come back because you've done a lot of work in the drug addiction area, and with regards to the stuff that's going on with homelessness and everything else, I think is a big question on people's minds. So we will come back to this question. Quentin will be back on the podcast. We'll talk more about that. But one of the questions I want to ask you, though, and I think this is a question a lot of people struggle with, is there's so much going on in our world right now. There's so much brokenness. There's so much to get frustrated and angry about. How do you remain hopeful? Like, how are you navigating that? Because I mean, you are on the front lines. There's so much going on. I mean, even before we started this podcast, I was like, hey, Quentin, we've got this news article that came out, and this thing came out, and this came out. I mean, we kind of get bombarded by it, and I think a lot of people, you can either get numb,
Mhm.
or just seriously depressed, right?
Yeah.
Just wondering, how do I stay hopeful? So how are you remaining hopeful in the midst of all this?
Uh, I would say the first answer is that beauty gives me hope, the beauty of the world, but the beauty that is expressed in each person as a image bearer of God. Um, one of the probably the most important story from that I could tell from my work at St. Paul's is that one time I was the triage nurse came and talked to me, and they said, this guy just came and registered, and he's like making all these weird movements. He's super disorganized. I don't know what he wants. He's making all the other patients uncomfortable. Can you go see him right away? Because we don't really know what's going on. And I walked out to the waiting room at St. Paul's, and there was this gentleman sitting right in the middle, and all the other patients had made a wide buffer zone around him. And he was sitting in the chair, and he was like rocking back and forth and mumbling to himself, and flailing his arms, and he smelled bad, and his hair was mad, and he was disheveled. And when I sat beside him and I had looked at his chart, I saw that he had a history of addiction to meth, and that he had expressed previously that he was trying to stop using. And when I sat beside him and I put my hand on his shoulder and I leaned forward to tell him who I was, and in that sort of second, I just listened to what he was saying, and I realized that he was praying.
Mm.
And he was saying to himself over and over again, "Dear Jesus, I don't need meth. Dear Jesus, I don't need meth. I don't need meth. I don't need meth." And I was so moved by the power of his prayer, and it was such a reminder to me of someone who would be so easy to overlook, and who who presented in a way that was unnerving to the people around him, but was an example of beauty to me. And he is not someone I should look down on. He's someone I should look up to in the intensity and perseverance of his prayer. And so, for people who feel defeated or afraid because of whatever is going on in their life or the world or society, I would say that the first hope is to look at your neighbors and the people around you and the people who God has put in your life, and uh, see and try to enjoy the beauty that is there. And the second thing I would say, which is probably the most important answer, is that underneath all forms of other forms of causality is the goodness of God, and the grace of God. And whatever direction our society or our civilization goes, there is a solid rock that even on the downtown east side, all tears will be wiped away. Even on the downtown east side, all will be well, and all manner of thing will be well. And we should, the Stoics of antiquity said, stiff upper lip, do not laugh, do not weep, just bear it. And Jesus says, weep with those who weep, mourn with those who mourn, suffer with those who suffer, but do so in good cheer, knowing that a day of hope is coming, a day of peace is coming. And so, that's what I encourage you. So,
we mourn, but we mourn with hope. Yeah. Hey, thank you so much, man, for being a part of the podcast. I really have appreciated our time together, getting to know you, and just your insights today has been really meaningful. We look forward to having you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's great for me to have the opportunity, and I like to talk, so I'm always happy to talk more.
Speaking of liking to talk, he'll be at the Apologetics Canada Conference coming here in March 2024. I'm sure we'll see him around with AC sooner. Thank you for joining us on the AC Podcast. It's a ministry of Apologetics Canada. We will be back next time with more things to think about. Until then, love God and love people. Bye for now.